On June 13, 1980, the body of Betty Lou Gore was found in her apartment after she had been cut 41 times with an axe by her husband's mistress. In the dim, quiet hours of a June afternoon in 1980, the tranquility of Wiley, Texas, was shattered by the discovery of a scene so grotesque it seemed to belong to another world. The home at 410 Dogwood Drive was no longer just a house but a macabre stage set for a tragedy. Here, in the utility room, lay Betty Gore, her life brutally extinguished by the force of an axe, the weapon discarded nearby, its blade stained with the evidence of its last act. 41 times, the axe had fallen, each strike echoing through the empty house with finality that spoke not just of violence but of a fury so profound it defied understanding. The walls, once adorned with the mundane signs of daily life, were now splattered with the grim testament of what had transpired. Blood had painted a narrative no one in this small town could have fathomed, transforming a simple utility room into a chilling tableau of horror. This was not just a crime scene. It was a puzzle wrapped in the enigma of human emotions, where love, betrayal, and rage had converged in the most lethal of ways. As the sun set on this day, casting long shadows over the once peaceful neighborhood, the question that lingered was not just who, but why. The brutality of the attack whispered of stories untold, of secrets hidden in plain sight, and of a mystery that would soon consume this community, challenging their perceptions of morality, justice, and the dark corners of the human psyche. Wiley, Texas, in 1980, was the epitome of small-town America, where the values of faith, family, and community were not just ideals but the very fabric of daily life. Nestled in the heart of Collin County, this town was a place where everyone knew everyone, where doors were left unlocked, and where the local Methodist church was the cornerstone of social life. Here, life moved at a pace dictated by the seasons, church gatherings, and school events, where the biggest news might be a new pastor or the annual bake sale. The streets of Wiley were lined with modest homes, each with its own patch of green where children played, oblivious to the complexities of the world beyond their games. The town's rhythm was set by church bells on Sunday mornings, the chatter of neighbors over fences, and the laughter from backyard barbecues. In such a setting, church wasn't just a place for worship but a community hub where bonds were forged, marriages blessed, and lives celebrated. In this backdrop of simplicity and piety, the idea of violence, especially of the brutal nature that befell Betty Gore, was an aberration, a discordant note in a symphony of small-town harmony. The murder was not just a crime, it was a profound disruption, an act so at odds with the town's identity that it shook the very foundations of trust and security. Here, where disputes were settled with words or perhaps a stern look from the church elders, the concept of someone taking another's life with such ferocity was unthinkable. It was as if a dark shadow had fallen over Wiley, revealing that even in places where faith and family reign supreme, the human heart can harbor storms unseen, capable of unleashing tempests of unimaginable violence. Betty Lou Gore was the embodiment of the American dream in Wiley, Texas. With her warm smile and a heart as open as the Texan sky, she was the quintessential small-town school teacher, loved by her students and respected by her peers. At 30, Betty had settled into her life with a sense of fulfillment, teaching young minds at the elementary school where she was known for her patience and dedication. Her love for her family was palpable. She was a devoted mother to her young daughter, Bethany, and a supportive wife to Alan. Betty's life was one of routine and joy, centered around her home, her classroom, and her church. Her days were filled with the simple pleasures of baking for church events, helping with homework, and the quiet pride of watching her students grow. Yet, beneath this outward calm was a woman who valued loyalty and trust above all, qualities that would tragically play a role in the events to come. Candy Wheeler Montgomery, at 30, appeared as the perfect complement to Wiley's idyllic setting. With her charming smile and engaging personality, she was the housewife everyone admired. Married to Pat Montgomery, they shared a life that looked enviable from the outside: 2 children, a nice home, and active roles in the community, particularly at the First United Methodist Church of Lucas. Candy was known for her volunteer work, her involvement in church choirs, and her seemingly endless energy for social gatherings. However, beneath this veneer of perfection lay a more complex personality. Candy was intellectually curious, often feeling unfulfilled by the traditional roles expected of her. She had a penchant for the dramatic and a deep-seated need for excitement, which led her to seek validation outside her marriage. This complexity was part of what drew her into the orbit of Alan Gore, revealing a side of her that was far from the image of the perfect housewife. Betty and Candy's friendship. Betty Gore and Candy Montgomery's friendship was forged in the communal spirit of the First United Methodist Church of Lucas. Their initial interactions were typical of church life: shared coffee after services, coordinating Sunday school activities, and participating in community events. Candy's outgoing nature and Betty's warm, welcoming demeanor made them natural friends. They bonded over shared responsibilities at church, their roles as mothers, and the mundane yet comforting rhythms of small-town life. Their friendship was one of mutual support, with Betty often confiding in Candy about her hopes for her daughter, Bethany, while Candy shared her volunteer work adventures. However, this friendship was underpinned by a subtle imbalance. Candy, with her vivaciousness, often seemed to be the one leading, while Betty, in her kindness, followed. This dynamic would later play a critical role in the unfolding drama. The church community. The church was more than just a place of worship. It was a heartbeat of Wiley's social fabric. Here, community was built on shared faith, with weekly gatherings strengthening bonds among families. The church's activities, from choir practices to Bible studies, were where Betty and Candy, along with their families, found common ground. The community prided itself on its closeness, where gossip was as commonplace as prayer but where support and camaraderie were the true currencies. The affair between Candy Montgomery and Alan Gore began innocuously, sparked during a volleyball game at a church event. The playful competition turned into lingering looks and shared laughter, igniting a spark neither expected. Their connection deepened one evening at a church function when, amidst the crowd, they found themselves talking about life's what-ifs, the dreams they harbored, and the unspoken desires they felt were stifled by their daily lives. Alan Gore was a man of contrasts, embodying the quiet strength expected of a family man in Wiley, yet harboring his own ambitions and desires. A software engineer by profession, his work often took him away from home, leaving Betty to manage the household. Alan was well-liked, known for his kindness, and his quiet demeanor that spoke of reliability. Yet, beneath this calm exterior was a man who, like many, found the pressures of an uneventful domestic life occasionally suffocating. His relationship with Candy Montgomery began as a friendship, nurtured in the church community, but it evolved into something more when both found themselves at a crossroads of emotional and physical longing. Alan's affair with Candy was not just a lapse in judgment, but a search for something different, something exciting, in the midst of a life that, while comfortable, lacked the spark he found in his clandestine meetings with Candy. The affair was clandestine from the start, fueled by secret meetings in cars or during Alan's business trips. There were bittersweet moments, the thrill of stolen kisses, the warmth of a hand held in secret, and the rush of feeling alive in ways they hadn't in years. They would meet at motels on the outskirts of town, where they could pretend, for a moment, that their lives were different, that they were free. However, these moments were laced with guilt and the ever-present fear of discovery. For Candy, the affair was both an escape and a validation of her desirability, something she felt was lacking in her marriage. For Alan, it was an adventure, a break from the monotony, but also a source of conflict, as his love for Betty and his life with her remained strong. As time passed, the affair began to wear on them. Candy felt the weight of deception, while Alan grappled with the dual life he was leading. The affair, once an exhilarating secret, became a burden. They decided to end it, seeking to return to their lives before the affair, but the decision was fraught with tension. Candy felt a loss of control, a part of her life ending, and Alan was left with the remnants of guilt and the fear that the affair might somehow come to light. The need to take care of it was not articulated in words but was a palpable undercurrent. Candy, with her penchant for drama and her fear of losing the thrill she had experienced, felt the affair's end like a personal defeat. Meanwhile, Alan, protective of his family, wanted to ensure that the affair remained buried, hoping life could return to normal. Yet, in the small, interconnected world of Wiley, secrets had a way of surfacing, setting the stage for the tragic events that would follow. Betty's inner conflicts. Betty Gore, on the surface, was the image of contentment, a loving mother, a dedicated teacher, and a faithful wife. However, beneath this facade of tranquility, she harbored a storm of inner conflicts. each one chipping away at the peace she so desperately tried to maintain. Candy's efforts to keep the affair going. Candy Montgomery was not one to easily let go of the thrill, the validation, and the escape the affair with Alan Gore provided. Her life, outwardly perfect, was internally fraught with a need for excitement, for feeling desired, for something beyond the routine of domesticity and church life. As the affair began to wane, Candy's efforts to sustain it grew more desperate. Candy used her charm to its fullest, orchestrating moments where she could catch Alan alone, whether at church events or through seemingly coincidental meetings. Her flirtations became more overt, her laughter more infectious, all in an attempt to reignite the spark. She played on Alan's guilt, hinting at how much she needed him, how his withdrawal was affecting her emotionally. Candy knew how to tug at heartstrings, making Alan feel responsible for her happiness or her potential despair. She sought out opportunities for physical closeness, knowing that once the line was crossed again, it might be harder for Alan to pull back. These encounters were less about love and more about holding on to the physical affirmation of her desirability. Alan Gore, on the other hand, was increasingly tormented by guilt and the desire to return to the simplicity and stability of his life with Betty. His initial involvement in the affair was as much about escaping the mundane as it was about seeking connection. But as time passed, Alan's love for Betty was genuine, and the affair gnawed at his conscience. He saw the potential harm it could bring to his family, to Bethany, to the life he had built. The thought of losing what he had with Betty became more terrifying than the thrill of the affair. The small-town dynamics meant that secrets rarely stayed buried. Alan was increasingly paranoid about whispers and glances, fearing the affair would come to light, destroying his reputation and his marriage. He yearned for the normalcy of his life before the affair, for the peace of mind that came with not carrying such a heavy secret. Alan began to pull away, making excuses to avoid meetings with Candy, hoping his resolve would help him disentangle from the web. As Alan's withdrawal became more apparent, Candy's world began to spiral. The affair had become an integral part of her identity, giving her a sense of being alive, of being special. Her thoughts were increasingly consumed by Alan, his actions, his words, or the lack thereof. She started to see signs where there were none, interpreting every interaction through the lens of their affair. Candy's obsession was not just about Alan, but about what he represented in her life: excitement, validation, escape. As Alan distanced himself, Candy's feelings morphed into resentment. She felt betrayed, not just by Alan but by the situation itself. How could something that had given her such joy now be taken away, leaving her to face a mundane reality alone? The sight of Alan with Betty, even in the most mundane of settings, stoked a jealousy within Candy. She envied Betty's place in Alan's life, the normalcy of their relationship, and the stability she herself craved but couldn't fully enjoy. Obsession, resentment, and jealousy brewed into something darker within Candy. Her need to regain control, to reclaim the part of her life she felt was slipping away, led her down a path of plotting. Candy considered ways to manipulate Alan back into the affair, or at least to ensure he couldn't be at peace without her. She thought of concocting scenarios where Alan would have to come back to her, perhaps out of guilt or necessity. The idea of confronting Betty began to take root in her mind, not with violence at first but with the intent to expose Alan's betrayal, thinking it might force a situation where she could step in. As her plans became more desperate, the line between rational thought and obsession blurred. Candy started to see the affairs end not just as the loss of a lover, but as a personal failure, an attack on her identity. This desperation could lead to rash decisions, driven by a need to reclaim what she felt was rightfully hers, culminating in the tragic events that would follow. June 13, 1980, dawned over Wiley, Texas, with a kind of gentle warmth that promises a day of simple pleasures and routine. The sun rose, casting golden hues over the modest homes, signaling the start of what should have been just another day in this quiet town. The birds sang their usual morning chorus, and the neighborhood was beginning to stir with the sounds of life: cars starting, children laughing, the distant bark of a dog. In the Gore household, the morning followed its predictable pattern. Betty, ever the early riser, was already up, her coffee brewing as she prepared breakfast for Bethany, who was getting ready for a day with friends. Betty moved with the grace of someone who had found comfort in the rhythm of her life. She packed lunches, signed permission slips, and exchanged the usual morning pleasantries with her daughter, her voice soft and warm. Alan, on the other hand, was preparing for another work trip, his suitcase half-packed. He moved with a sense of duty, kissing Betty goodbye with the routine affection of long-married couples. There was nothing in their interactions to suggest the storm brewing beneath the surface. They spoke of mundane things, the weather, Bethany's weekend plans, Alan's travel itinerary, a conversation that could have been plucked from any morning in their life together. Meanwhile, Candy Montgomery's morning had a different tone. Her house was one of controlled chaos, with her children needing attention, and Pat, her husband, already at work. Candy, in her colorful robe, was a whirlwind of activity, but beneath her busy hands and bright smile was a mind caught in turmoil. The affair's end had left her feeling unmoored, her day beginning with a sense of loss rather than the usual anticipation of what lay ahead. Today, she was particularly restless, her thoughts frequently drifting to Alan, each mundane task a reminder of what she felt she was missing. As the morning progressed, the contrast between the ordinary and impending tragedy became stark. Betty, with her plans to tend to her garden later, was the picture of domestic contentment, unaware of the darkness about to descend. Alan, with his mind on work and guilt, was obliviously stepping toward the precipice of a life-altering event. Candy, driven by her unresolved emotions and the desire to confront what she could no longer control, was setting the stage for the day's horrifying climax. The town of Wiley, with its churches, schools, and homes, was none the wiser to the storm about to break. The morning's tranquility was the calm before a storm, a stark juxtaposition to the violence and sorrow that would soon shatter this peaceful facade. Each person went about their day, none suspecting that this ordinary Friday would be remembered, not for its simplicity, but for the tragedy that would forever alter the course of their lives. Candy's morning had been one of restless anticipation, the end of the affair with Alan leaving her with a void she couldn't fill. When she heard that Alan was away on business, she saw an opportunity, or perhaps an excuse, to visit Betty's house under the pretense of picking up a swimsuit for Bethany, who was supposed to join Candy's children for a play date. Every step she took towards Betty's home was fueled by a mix of dread and determination. She needed closure, or perhaps a way to reignite what was lost. Entering the Gores' home, the air was thick with the scent of normalcy, coffee, perhaps, or the remnants of breakfast. Candy's heart was pounding, her mind racing with rehearsed conversations, yet nothing prepared her for the reality of facing Betty. The small talk about the children, the weather, was just a prelude to the storm she was about to unleash. When the moment came, it was almost accidental, a slip of the tongue or calculated move. Candy can't later recall. Alan and I. She began, the words hanging in the air like a confession or a challenge. The pause was charged. With those 3 words, she had crossed a line, bringing the affair into the light of day. She watched Betty's face for a reaction, expecting anger, but what she saw was a mix of shock and hurt that she hadn't anticipated. For Betty, the morning had been one of routine, her mind on the tasks ahead, the garden, perhaps some grading. When Candy arrived, Betty was genuinely pleased to see her, inviting her in with the warmth of long friendship. They talked about mundane things, the kind of conversation that fills the space between friends. Betty was in the midst of fetching a swimsuit when Candy's words pierced the ordinary with something sharp and unexpected. Alan and I. The words were like a cold blade through her heart. Betty's initial reaction was disbelief, a refusal to process what was being implied. Her world, so carefully constructed around her roles as wife and mother, seemed to tilt. She looked at Candy, searching for a sign that this was some cruel jest, but the look in Candy's eyes told her otherwise. There was a blend of defiance and sorrow there, a silent acknowledgment of betrayal. The air in the room changed, the warmth replaced by a chilling tension. Betty felt a surge of emotions, anger, despair, confusion. Her voice, when it came, was a wisp of disbelief turning into a demand for truth. "What do you mean, Candy?" The question was more than just about the affair. It was a plea for understanding how her life had come to this moment. From Candy's perspective, the confrontation spiraled out of control. She had intended to talk, perhaps manipulate the situation back in her favor, but Betty's reaction, the raw pain in her eyes, stirred something in Candy. Guilt, perhaps, or defensive anger. The conversation turned from words to accusations, from accusations to shouts. Candy felt cornered, her control slipping. When Betty, in her shock and anger, grabbed something, an axe, the tool for a mundane chore now turned weapon, it was as if all pretense was gone. Betty, overwhelmed by a betrayal she couldn't fathom, felt a primal urge to defend her home, her life. Her grabbing the axe was an act born of desperation, a physical manifestation of her inner turmoil. She didn't intend to use it, but in the heat of the moment, with emotions at a fever pitch, the line between intention and action blurred. When Candy saw the axe in Betty's hand, fear mingled with her rage. In her recount, she would later claim self-defense, that Betty had swung at her first. But in those chaotic seconds, where words failed and emotions reigned, what followed was a blur of violence. Candy, in her panic or fury, took the axe from Betty, and in a moment of dissociative rage or self-preservation, she struck. Once, twice, the count lost to the horror of the act itself. For Betty, the world narrowed to the pain, the shock, the betrayal. Her last moments were a confusion of fear and hurt, her life ending in the utility room of her home, surrounded by the mundane objects of daily life, now witnesses to an unthinkable tragedy. The utility room, once a place of routine chores, became the scene of a brutal crime. Candy Montgomery, in a moment of uncontrolled fury or terror, took the axe from Betty's grasp. The violence that followed was savage, 41 strikes in total, most aimed at Betty's head. Each blow was a testament to the unleashed rage or fear, turning the room into a macabre tableau of blood and horror. The axe, now a weapon of destruction, left a pattern of devastation that was as shocking as it was relentless. At the heart of this act was Candy's psyche, a complex tapestry of emotions and psychological states. Candy would later assert that her actions were in self-defense. Betty's initial move, according to Candy's recount, Betty had initially swung the axe at her, a reaction to the overwhelming betrayal. This moment, Candy claimed, was when she feared for her life, prompting her to take the axe. Candy described the subsequent strikes as a desperate act of survival, her mind blanking out in the fear of the moment, not calculating the extent of her retaliation. Perhaps the most controversial aspect of the crime was Candy's claim of a dissociative episode. Psychological snap. Candy explained that after the initial confrontation, she experienced a psychological break. She described it as if she was watching herself from outside her body, a defense mechanism against the overwhelming emotional and physical threat she perceived. Childhood trauma. Her defense would later delve into her past, citing childhood trauma as a catalyst for this dissociative state. When Betty shushed her during their argument, it was said to trigger a flashback to her youth, where she felt silenced and powerless, leading to an explosive, uncontrollable response. The act itself. During this episode, Candy said she felt detached, the violence an almost automatic response to the fear and the need to protect herself from further harm or emotional destruction. Her memory of the act was fragmented, clouded by this psychological detachment. The discovery. The day had been long for Alan Gore, filled with the usual tedium of business meetings, but it was the unexpected decision to return home early that would change his life forever. His trip, meant to span several days, was cut short due to a sudden cancellation, leaving him with a mix of relief and anticipation to be back with his family. Little did he know, his homecoming would be to a scene of unimaginable horror. Alan's return. As the Texas sunset painted the sky with hues of orange and red, Alan's car pulled into the familiar driveway of his Wiley home. The house looked as it always did, the front porch light welcoming him back. He carried his suitcase inside, expecting the warmth of family greetings, the scent of dinner perhaps, or the sound of Bethany playing. Instead, he was met with an eerie silence, the house unusually quiet. Calling out for Betty, his voice echoed through the rooms, unanswered. A sense of unease crept over him. This was not how he pictured his return. The grim discovery. Alan moved through the house, checking the living room, the kitchen, no sign of Betty or Bethany. His heart rate quickened with each step, worry turning to fear. He called out again, louder this time, the silence more oppressive than before. It was in the utility room, a place of mundane tasks like laundry and cleaning, that Alan's worst fears crystallized into reality. There, in the stark contrast of a well-lit room, he saw Betty. The sight was so jarring, so out of place with the normalcy of their life. that for a moment, time seemed to stop. Betty lay on the floor, her body still, surrounded by a pool of blood. The axe, a tool he knew well for its practical uses, lay nearby, its blade and handle stained with the evidence of its recent, horrific use. The room, with its white walls now splattered with red, its concrete floor a canvas of tragedy, was a scene of such violence that Alan's mind struggled to comprehend it. The shock was profound, his body moving automatically as he approached, calling out her name with a voice that was more a broken whisper than a shout. He reached for her, hoping against hope for some sign of life. But the stillness of her form, the blood, the sheer brutality of what had happened, confirmed the terrible truth. Aftermath of discovery. In those first moments, Alan was consumed by a mix of grief, shock, and a surreal sense of detachment. His mind raced through possibilities, none of which made sense in the quiet, peaceful life he believed they led. He stumbled back, his phone in hand, dialing for help in a daze, his voice trembling as he tried to articulate the horror to the emergency operator. The police would arrive soon after, finding Alan in a state of shock, his home now a crime scene, his life forever altered. The discovery of Betty's body by Alan, in the very place where so much of their family life had unfolded, was the beginning of an investigation that would delve into the secrets and shadows of Wiley, Texas, revealing layers of a community and the individuals within it that no one had anticipated. The investigation. The Wiley Police Department was thrust into action upon receiving Alan Gore's frantic call. What followed was a meticulous but initially perplexing investigation into the murder of Betty Gore. Initial steps. Securing the scene. The first officers on the scene immediately secured the area, ensuring no evidence was disturbed. The utility room was cordoned off, and the house was treated as a crime scene. Evidence collection. Forensic teams were called in to document the scene with photographs, collect fingerprints, and gather any physical evidence like blood samples, hair, and fibers. The axe, a key piece of evidence, was carefully bagged for further analysis. Autopsy. The medical examiner was summoned to perform an autopsy, which would later confirm the cause of death as multiple blunt force traumas to the head, highlighting the sheer brutality of the attack. Interview with Alan Gore. Alan was interviewed at length, his shock and grief palpable. His account of finding Betty was recorded, and his alibi for the day was verified. His early return from the business trip was checked, confirming his story. Neighborhood canvass. Police canvassed the neighborhood, questioning neighbors for any unusual sightings or sounds. They sought to establish the timeline of the day, especially around the time Betty was believed to have been killed. Lack of suspects. No obvious perpetrator. Initially, there were no clear suspects. The Gores were described as a quiet, well-liked family with no known enemies. The brutality of the crime suggested personal involvement, but without immediate leads, the investigation seemed to hit a wall. Community shock. Wiley was in shock. The crime was so out of character for their peaceful town that everyone was a suspect in the eyes of the law, yet no one seemed likely. The police looked into Betty's students, colleagues, and even distant relatives, but nothing pointed to a motive or suspect. The affair comes to light. Alan's confession. Under the strain of the investigation and the overwhelming guilt, Alan eventually disclosed his affair with Candy Montgomery. This revelation came during a follow-up interview when detectives, probing for any reason someone might want to harm Betty, asked about personal relationships. Alan, initially reluctant, confessed, believing it might be connected to the murder. Candy's involvement. With this new information, the police shifted their focus to Candy. Her relationship with Betty, her access to the Gore home, and her connection to Alan made her a person of interest. They interviewed Candy, who initially appeared cooperative but whose story seemed to have gaps or inconsistencies under scrutiny. Corroboration. The affair was further corroborated through interviews with church members and friends who had noticed changes in Candy's and Alan's behavior or had heard rumors. The investigation began piecing together how such a secret could have led to the day's events. Physical evidence. A search of Candy's home led to the discovery of clothing with blood stains, later confirmed through forensic testing to match Betty's blood type, although DNA testing was not as advanced at the time. This physical evidence, combined with Alan's confession of the affair, moved Candy from person of interest to prime suspect. The revelation of the affair was a turning point in the investigation, providing a motive where before there had been none. It shifted the focus from a random act of violence to one potentially driven by jealousy, betrayal, or revenge, setting the stage for a deeper dive into the lives of those involved and the dynamics of their relationships. The small-town police force now faced the challenge of unraveling the truth behind a facade of respectability and community. The arrest. As the evidence and testimonies began to paint a clearer picture, the focus of the investigation zeroed in on Candy Montgomery. Candy becomes the prime suspect. With blood-stained clothing found at Candy's home, her inconsistent statements during interviews, and the affair now public knowledge, the police had enough to consider Candy a prime suspect. The physical evidence, combined with the motive provided by her relationship with Alan, was compelling. Candy was brought in for a more thorough interrogation. Here, the police pressed her on her movements on the day of the murder, her relationship with Betty, and the affair. Despite her attempts to maintain composure, the cracks in her story, especially regarding her time at the Gore house, were evident. Confronted with the blood-stained evidence, Candy's demeanor shifted, a mix of fear and resignation setting in as the reality of her situation became undeniable. The moment of arrest, after hours of questioning, with no satisfactory explanation for the blood on her clothes or her presence at the scene of the crime, the decision was made. Officers entered the interview room, and with a solemn formality, one of them read Candy her rights. "Candy Montgomery, you are under arrest for the murder of Betty Gore." The handcuffs were a stark reality, a symbol of the gravity of the accusations against her. Her arrest was not discreet. She was led out of the police station in view of neighbors, friends, and church members who had gathered, drawn by the news. The sight of Candy, someone so familiar to the community, in handcuffs was jarring. The community of Wiley was stunned. Candy was not just any resident. She was a pillar of the church, a mother, a friend. Her arrest shattered the illusion of safety and sanctity that the town prided itself on. Whispers turned into open speculation, with shock giving way to a mix of disbelief and condemnation. The reaction was not uniform. Some rallied around Candy, unable or unwilling to believe she could commit such an act, citing her involvement in community activities and her generally cheerful disposition. Others felt betrayed, their trust in the veneer of their community life deeply shaken. The church, where both Candy and Betty were active, became a focal point of this turmoil. Sermons took on new meanings, with discussions about sin, forgiveness, and judgment. The congregation was divided between those who wanted to support Candy and those who felt she had brought shame upon their fellowship. The small-town gossip machine went into overdrive. Theories about what might have driven Candy to murder proliferated, with the affair becoming the subject of intense scrutiny and whispered conversations. The community's perception of privacy and trust was fundamentally altered. While some grappled with the implications for Candy, there was also a strong wave of support for the Gore family, especially for Alan and Bethany. People brought meals, offered condolences, and rallied around them, though Alan's involvement in the affair complicated these gestures with undercurrents of judgment. The trial of Candy Montgomery. The courthouse in Kinney, Texas, was transformed into the epicenter of a drama that had captured not just the town of Wiley but the nation's attention. The courtroom was modest, its wooden panels and high ceilings giving it an air of solemnity, but on this day, it was anything but ordinary. The benches, usually occupied by locals for mundane legal affairs, were packed, not just with residents but with journalists, curiosity seekers, and those drawn by the scandal. Crowd and atmosphere. The air was charged with a mix of anticipation and tension. Spectators whispered, some casting glances at Candy, who sat at the defense table, her demeanor a curious blend of poise and vulnerability. The prosecution's side was equally notable, with Alan Gore, looking haggard and grief-stricken, often the subject of sympathetic looks. National spotlight. This case had all the makings of a media sensation, small-town scandal, church community, infidelity, and a brutal murder. National news crews had set up outside, their vans and equipment turning the courthouse into a temporary broadcast hub. Photographers vied for the best angles, capturing every moment from the arrival of key figures to the expressions of those entering the courtroom. Local newspapers and radio stations had extensive coverage, with reporters mingling among the crowd to gather reactions, opinions, and any new developments. The trial was not just about justice. It was a spectacle, a story that would be told and retold in Wiley for generations. Prosecution. The prosecution, led by a seasoned attorney, aimed to paint a picture of premeditation and rage. They began by describing Betty Gore as an innocent victim, a beloved teacher and mother, whose life was cut short in a gruesome act of violence. The prosecution portrayed the case as an act of betrayal, about an affair that turned deadly. And they provided evidence to show that Candy Montgomery, driven by jealousy and a desire to maintain her illicit relationship with Alan Gore, took Betty Gore's life in a fit of uncontrollable rage. They promised to bring forth forensic evidence, the blood-stained clothes, expert witnesses on the nature of the wounds, and testimonies that would reveal Candy's state of mind and actions leading up to the murder. The defense, aware of the uphill battle, focused on humanizing Candy and presenting the killing as an act of self-defense triggered by an extreme psychological reaction. The defense described Candy as a woman caught in a moment of terror and trauma. They further demonstrated that on that fateful day, Candy was defending herself against an attack by Betty Gore, who was armed with an axe. Furthermore, they introduced evidence of a dissociative episode, a psychological condition brought on by overwhelming stress and fear. They planned to delve into Candy's background, her history of trauma, and bring in expert psychologists to explain the concept of dissociation, arguing that Candy was not in control when the violence occurred. Friends, family, and church members would testify to Candy's character, her community involvement, and her role as a mother and wife, aiming to portray her as someone out of character for such a crime under normal circumstances. The jury, a mix of locals, seemed to absorb the opening statements with a mix of curiosity and gravity, aware that their decision would resonate far beyond the courtroom. Outside, opinions were already forming. Some were swayed by the prosecution's portrayal of a calculated killer, while others were touched by the defense's plea for understanding the complexities of human psychology and behavior. Alan Gore's presence was a silent testament to the tragedy, his face reflecting a man torn between seeking justice for his wife and grappling with his own culpability in the drama that unfolded. The trial of Candy Montgomery. One of the most pivotal moments of the trial was when Candy took the stand. Her voice, calm yet strained, described the confrontation with Betty. She recounted, "When Betty shushed me, it was like I was back in my childhood, feeling powerless, silenced. I didn't choose what happened next." Candy described the moment she saw the axe in Betty's hands, the fear that engulfed her, and then a sudden, inexplicable shift. "I felt like I wasn't in my body anymore," she said, her eyes distant as if reliving the moment. "It was like I was watching from above. Everything was happening, but I wasn't there." The prosecution tried to dismantle her story, questioning the plausibility of such a state, suggesting it was a convenient excuse for murder. However, Candy held firm, her testimony painting a picture of a woman whose actions were not entirely under her control. Expert psychological evidence. Dr. Fred Faison, a psychologist, was called by the defense to explain dissociation. He testified that under extreme stress or trauma, individuals can experience a dissociative state where they act defensively without conscious control. Faison linked Candy's childhood trauma and the stress of the confrontation to her dissociative episode, arguing that the sheer number of strikes could be explained by this psychological breakdown rather than premeditated murder. His testimony was crucial in providing a scientific basis for Candy's defense, offering jurors a lens through which to view her actions as a product of mental turmoil rather than malice. Emotional testimonies. Alan's testimony was heart-wrenching, his voice breaking as he described finding Betty. He spoke of their life together, their daughter, and his regret over the affair. "I loved Betty. I never wanted any of this," he said, his testimony humanizing Betty beyond the victim label, making the tragedy personal to the jury. Alan's admission of the affair was central, highlighting the betrayal that might have precipitated the confrontation. His testimony was a double-edged sword, providing motive for Candy's actions while also eliciting sympathy for Betty's plight. Friends and family. Testimonies from Betty's friends painted her as a loving, kind individual, reinforcing the prosecution's narrative of an innocent victim. They spoke of her dedication to her family and community, making her loss felt deeply by the jury. On the other hand, Candy's friends and family members spoke of her character, her involvement in church and community events, and her role as a mother. They portrayed her as someone who wouldn't normally commit such an act, supporting the defense's claim of an out-of-character action due to extreme circumstances. Testimonies from church members varied, some speaking to the close-knit nature of their community, others subtly hinting at the undercurrents of gossip and judgment that might have influenced the events. Key moments. During cross-examination, When pressed hard by the prosecution, Candy had a moment of visible breakdown, crying as she struggled to explain the inexplicable, her actions during the dissociative state. This humanized her in the eyes of some jurors, showing her as genuinely remorseful or affected. The battle of psychological interpretations between expert witnesses from both sides added a layer of complexity to the trial, turning it into not just a legal battle but a psychological one. Alan's palpable guilt and sorrow during his testimony swayed public and juror sentiment in various directions, some seeing him as a catalyst for the tragedy, others as another victim of the circumstances. The verdict. After weeks of testimonies, evidence, and emotional courtroom drama, the jury retired to deliberate. The small room where they convened was charged with the weight of their decision. The air was thick with tension, each juror bringing their own interpretation of the trial's events. They were tasked with reconciling the brutality of the crime with the psychological defense presented. The deliberations were intense, with debates over the validity of the dissociative state defense, the nature of self-defense, and the morality of the affair. Some jurors focused on the forensic evidence and the sheer number of strikes, arguing for premeditation. Others were swayed by the psychological testimony, the character witnesses for Candy, and the context of the confrontation. They meticulously went through the evidence again, from the blood-stained clothes to the psychological reports, trying to piece together the puzzle of Candy Montgomery's mind and actions. After just over 3 hours, the jury returned with their verdict. The courtroom was silent, all eyes on the jury foreman as he stood to announce, "We, the jury, find the defendant, Candy Montgomery, not guilty." Gasps, murmurs, and a few stifled sobs filled the room. Candy's face showed relief mixed with an unreadable emotion, while Alan Gore seemed to slump, the verdict a complex mix of relief from legal proceedings but no closure for his personal tragedy. The community and the wider public were deeply divided. Some felt justice was served, believing in the complexity of human psychology and the possibility of a dissociative episode. Others were outraged, feeling that the brutality of the act should have warranted a guilty verdict regardless of mental state. The media dissected the verdict, with op-eds, talk shows, and news segments debating the ethics of the defense, the role of psychology in law, and the impact on victims' families. In Wiley, the verdict left a lasting scar. Church gatherings were awkward. Some members felt Candy should be shunned, while others believed in forgiveness or at least understanding. The case sparked discussions on morality, justice, and the nature of human behavior in the community. Jury's reasoning. The key to the acquittal was the establishment of reasonable doubt. The defense successfully cast doubt on whether Candy was in control of her actions at the moment of the crime, leaning heavily on the expert psychological testimony about dissociation. Although the self-defense claim was controversial due to the number of strikes, the jury considered the initial threat posed by Betty holding the axe and the extreme emotional state Candy described. Several jurors admitted to being swayed by the human elements of the case, Candy's life, her role in the community, and the testimony of her character. They struggled with the idea of punishing someone for an act they might not have been fully conscious of committing. There was also a sense of sympathy for Alan Gore, whose affair was seen as a catalyst, though not an excuse for the crime. This complex sympathy might have influenced the jury to view the situation as a tragic chain of events rather than straightforward murder. The verdict of not guilty was not just the end of a trial, but the beginning of a long healing process for all involved, with the community left to grapple with the nuances of justice, morality, and the dark corners of human psychology. The case of Candy Montgomery would linger in public memory, a testament to the complexities of the human condition and the legal system's attempt to navigate them. Life after. After her acquittal, Candy and her husband, Pat, moved away from Wiley, seeking a fresh start away from the scrutiny and judgment. The move was an attempt to rebuild their lives, but the shadow of the trial followed. Their marriage strained under the weight of the event, eventually leading to divorce. Candy changed her name and tried to live a life out of the public eye, but the notoriety never fully faded. Despite the verdict, Candy lived with the psychological and emotional aftermath of the crime and trial. The trauma of the event, coupled with the public's divided opinion of her, left deep scars. Alan was left to deal with profound grief for Betty, compounded by guilt over his role in the affair. He struggled with public perception, some viewing him as partly responsible for the tragedy. His focus shifted to raising his daughter, Bethany, amidst media attention and community whispers. They, 2. Eventually move away from Wiley, seeking privacy and a new beginning, though the tragedy was always a part of her family narrative. Betty's family, particularly her parents, were left to mourn in the public eye, their grief complicated by the sensational nature of the case. They had to navigate the loss of a daughter and sister while dealing with the public's fascination with her death. Public mourning. The community organized memorials for Betty, but her family had to contend with the fact that her story was now part of true crime history, not just a private tragedy. Wiley was divided. Some residents felt the verdict was a miscarriage of justice, while others sought to move on, believing in the legal system's decision. The church community was particularly affected, with sermons reflecting on forgiveness, judgment, and the human condition. Attendance fluctuated as some members left, unable to reconcile their faith with the events. Over time, community gatherings focused on healing, with events aimed at bringing people together, though the case was seldom mentioned directly, its shadow ever present. Like and subscribe to our channel for more chilling true crime stories.